you. Okay, should we get started? All right. So we want to offer first recognition and respect to the Indigenous people who are traditional occupants of the land that we're on. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or in a historical context. Colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation in that. It's also worth noting that acknowledging the land is an Indigenous protocol. So I want to start by acknowledging that I am in Carrboro in North Carolina, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Catawba, the Shakori, and the Eno people.
And I would like to also begin by acknowledging that I am in Burlington, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Catawba, the Shakori, the Eno, and the Saponi people.
As we continue, we're going to invite you to go to the Native Land website, which I think Dyson is going to go ahead and put in the chat. And just go ahead and go to it right now as we continue to talk and find out whose ancestral land you are currently on, and just put it in the chat so we can see sort of where we are all situated right now. As you guys all sort of do that, as you all do that, I'd like to read a statement from the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, which is a people-powered department that is a grassroots action network inciting creativity and social imagination should shape a culture of empathy, equity, and belonging. As a step toward honoring the truth and achieving healing and reconciliation, our organization commits to open all public events and gatherings with a statement acknowledging the traditional native lands on which we stand. Such statements become truly meaningful when coupled with authentic relationships and sustained commitment. We therefore commit to move beyond words into programs and actions that fully embody a commitment to Indigenous rights and cultural equity. So from the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture's Guide to Honoring Native Lands, here are some ways that you can move into action. Find out if there are active Native groups or organizations in or near your community. Learn about their work and see how you can support them. Be in touch with local Native community members to discern how best to introduce the practice of acknowledgement and explore how that might lead to further dialogue and collaboration. Look around you and ask yourself, are there Native folks present at your events, on your team, on your board? And if not, what would it take to begin those relationships? How might you move from acknowledgement into relationship? If your role involves programming at a cultural or educational institution, how might you ensure the programming itself represents a commitment to Native voices, stories, and perspectives? And follow Indigenous leadership on efforts to resist destruction of land and life. In the chat, we're also going to drop a few organizations that you can check out to sort of begin this work. Okay, so my name is TRILCE MARQUEZ. I identify as Brown and Latinx, and I use the pronouns she, her, and ella.
And my name is Dyson Pasion. I identify as Brown and Latinx, and I use the pronouns he, him, and él. Again, thank you again so much for joining us today, and thank you so much, TRILCE, for taking us through that Indigenous protocol and practice of acknowledging the land that we stand on and recognizing those who have come before us. Today, we're gonna really take you through our experiences as educators who identify as Brown and Latinx. We're gonna be sharing our stories and experiences from the student perspective, but then also we're going to be talking about what it means to be a Latinx educator and how we can celebrate Latinx identities in our classrooms, schools, and spaces. And at the end, we'll have some time for question and answers. So hopefully we'll go ahead and get started so we can have some time for that.
Okay, we're going to start with just our personal stories and experiences so you get to know who we are and sort of where we're coming from. So I can't begin my own story without going back to before I was born, to the moment where my parents picked my name for me. My parents chose the name TRILCE, and you'll notice that it sounds different than when I introduced myself before. And I mean, that is a current process that I'm going through, is understanding the meaning and the sound of my name. But my parents chose the name TRILCE, and that was the name of a poetry book written by Cesar Vallejo, who is a Peruvian poet. TRILCE was published in 1922, and it was actually written while he was incarcerated. Cesar Vallejo was considered, and I quote, at the forefront of avant-garde poetry because of the poem's aggressive syntax, with innovative use of alliteration and raw language that moved away from the standard Spanish poetry of the time. So essentially, he was working to decolonize language, poetry, and expression, which to me as an adult is really speaking to me more and more as I work to decolonize my understanding of my own name. Vallejo created the word trilce, which is the combination of two Spanish words, triste and dulce, which means sad and sweet. You know, I've been thinking a lot about naming, and naming is this exercise in power, right? Like, who gets the right to name or name others? Whose stories are honored in a name and whose stories are erased in a name? And because of that, I feel like our names have a lot of weight and they have a lot of meaning, either because someone else chose the name for you or because we choose our names for ourselves. I'm in the process of choosing my name for myself. Even though my parents gave it to me, I am at 35 really beginning the work of reclaiming my name. Names also have meaning because they can change and they evolve, they can be shortened or they can be adapted. You know, names can be sources of pride and joy, or they can be sources of pain and disappointment. When I first moved to the United States, I was 5, and I hated my name. I really did. For a long time, I hated my name. No one could say my name. My name is really difficult for non-native Spanish speakers. You know, the beginning of my name, that right, is really hard. And often when people look at my name and all of its letters sort of together, I think it just feels confusing, like the order of the letters or something about that is difficult for people to sort of just read and say like, oh, I think I know how to say that. And it gives people a lot of pause. The only people who continue to say my name correctly are my parents and some of my immediate family. But I've long sort of stopped trying to correct people when they say my name. It's hard enough for people to say the anglicized version of my name. Trilce is hard for most people anyway. So the process of correcting them to Trilce has been one that I gave up a long time ago. I was speaking with my mom recently and she told me that for the first few years that we moved to the United States, you know, my parents really worked to correct my teachers and my new friends in saying my name, but they kind of gave up because people refused to say my name correctly. And they probably also gave up because I really fought against saying my name correctly. I didn't want it to be hard for other people to say my name. I wanted to fit in. I wanted to be a Melissa. You know, Melissa is my cousin's name, and I wanted that name for myself. I wanted it to be easy. So I began to say my name incorrectly too. So sort of in thinking about this process of names being super important and places that can feel really empowering, right? As I'm sort of learning now, I feel empowered with my name, and I'm really sort of like digging into what does it mean to be named Trilce, and how do I ask others to call me correctly? But also places of pain, right? I spent most of my time correcting other people on how to say my name incorrectly, and that was painful. I wanted to invite all of you to take a moment, if you're feeling comfortable, in the chat, to share any moments of joy, of love, of memory or meaning, or even of pain that you've had with your own name. So just take a few moments and sort of, as we continue talking, just think about, you know, the ways that we've all experienced sort of different reactions to how people are able to say our names and connect with that part of who we are. Yeah, I'm seeing, I just want to look in the chat as we're going. Yeah, you know, so, and sometimes I would talk to my students about my name also, and sort of the history, and a lot of the times they would be like, well, I don't know, I've never asked about my name, you know, and names can have such deep family meaning too, right? These are such wonderful stories. Thank you. And thank you for being so open to sharing your stories around your names too. Please continue reading some of and sharing as we keep going. So I was born in Venezuela, which is a country of warmth and jungles that meet beaches. And my body still wants to spend most of its time in the warmth of the sun. I am in no way a cold weather fan, and my friends give me a really hard time when it gets anywhere below 50 degrees. I'm in like a full body, full length to my ankles parka. Even though they give me a hard time, I really think about it as my body's way of grounding me to the place where I was born. The warmth of the land that is almost always bathed in light and heat, and I feel rooted when I'm in the sun. I feel connected when I'm near water, and I don't want to ignore the pull of the land that I'm from. And so I thought I'd share that part of me with you too. This is where I'm from, and that's part of my, you know, like very real identity. I want to tell you all something. So my mom yesterday, we had been talking about getting pictures. Yesterday, she came over and dropped off a thumb drive that had so many family photos. And so I had some that had gone into the presentation before, but I just changed them yesterday. And it's giving me so much joy to see these pictures of my parents. Both of my parents are Venezuelan. My white mom married my brown dad, un morenito, I think she would say. My dad and I shared this identity of morenitos. It could feel sort of like a fun kind of bond, you know. I remember when we would go to the beach or we would be outside, you know, like my dad and I didn't need the same kind of sunscreen that, you know, my mom and my brother and the rest of the family needed. Like, that is not true. Please always wear sunscreen. Like, but like that was sort of like the secret, right? Like, we didn't burn the way that my mom did or my brother did. Our skin sort of like immediately darkened as soon as we were in the sun, and it felt special. It felt different from the white people around me and around us. But there were some really problematic things that I had to unlearn from that. You know, it was really special to be like my dad, to be brown, to have skin that sort of like soaks up the sun. But the older that I got, the more exotic I noticed that became to other people around me. The more people sort of wanted to touch my brownness, wanted to comment on the way that my skin changed. I also learned that while it might feel special to be brown, right? I had this connection with my dad that was different. I learned that I didn't want to be too brown. I didn't want to get too much sun. I didn't want to get too dark. My grandmother once told me to get out of the sun when I visited her, that I was getting too dark. So I learned this anti-Blackness from my family from a really, really young age. And while my brownness was always commented on, right? La morenita, you know, the skin, my whiteness was not. Because sometimes I'm white presenting, but that felt normal. That was like the rest of the family. And we didn't need to talk about what was normal, what was the default. We only needed to talk about the difference in comparison to the whiteness. So I really learned to ignore my whiteness and view it as sort of the default, right? And to see my brownness as really different and exotic while making no mention of my whiteness. And those are things that even as an adult, I've had to really unpack and unlearn and really dig into. What does it mean to have skin that changes, skin that goes from white presenting to brown, right? Where is my privilege in that space, and how do I sort of navigate that? So this was my experience my whole life. This otherness around my brownness and my inability to sort of recognize my whiteness and my privilege. I went to middle school and high school in Chapel Hill. My friends were predominantly white, with the exception of freshman year in high school, where I met other brown Latinx kids. But the thing was that I quickly realized that they weren't seen as sort of the good kind of Latinx, right? They were labeled delinquent kids. They were not assimilating. That year was a really difficult lesson in learning that even though there was something really special to me about hearing Spanish from my friends, not just from my mom and my dad, that I could not be that bad kind of Latinx. I had to assimilate, right? I had to be quiet. That message came from my parents, it came from my teachers, and eventually it came from my white peers, sort of pressuring me to leave those friends behind. I went to college at UNC Asheville. This is a photo from that time. At the time that I was there, it was 98% white, and that was very comfortable for me, right? It wasn't until I moved to New York City after college that I began to sort of understand more fully the way that my identity had been erased. And now I think I'm going to pass it on to Dyson.
So Trilce and I share some similarities in our stories. Where Trilce ends her story in New York City, that's where mine begins. Well, part of my story begins there, but even you have to even go back further to see to know my family. So both my mother and father, who met in New York City, are from Colombia, or Colombia, right? My mom is from Cali, which is nestled in the valley of the Andes, right? And then my father is from Barranquilla. It's about a 22-hour car ride from each other, but they met in New York City, and specifically in Queens, in Jamaica, Queens, which is where I was born. So the images that you see there, that's my mom and myself on the 7 in Queens, and her family to the right of her mother and father, my abuelos, and her brothers and sisters, and then that's me, cute little kid, right? And then the image to the left of me is an image of my father, who I have not seen since the age of 9. And that's part of my story is that I don't half of my family lineage I really don't know or understand. But still, it's important to be able to acknowledge that and bring that into this space today. And because of that, my story and my upbringing really centers around strong women. So here is a picture of my grandmother and my mother. My grandmother on the left, Rosario Rosalia de Vega, and my mother, Rosario Rosales, who changed her name to Maricel Murray, but we'll get into that in just a second. And then there's in the middle the image of my mom and my abuela during her first communion, and just the struggle that both of these women have had to go through in order to provide for their family. My grandparents separated when my mother was 7, and my grandmother had to raise 5 children on her own. And then she sent her youngest daughter to the United States, and my mom did not want to come to the United States. She wanted to stay in Colombia with her family. She always tells me half of her heart is still in Colombia. And even for being here for so long, she still longs to go back. But my mother, at the age of 20, without knowing the language, came to the United States. She came via plane to Jamaica. From Jamaica, chartered another plane to the Bahamas, and from the Bahamas was on a small sport boat that came into Miami. And as you can guess, she was undocumented at the time. Her journey to the United States was dangerous. It was paid for and planned out in Cali, Colombia. But by the time she got on the boat, she had to then provide more money that she was unaware of to finish her journey. She had to dump all of her luggage because they could not carry the weight of all the people and the luggage on the small boat. And then she was also informed that if the Coast Guard approached, that everyone would have to jump in the water and fend for themselves. The journey for my mom took 5 days to get from Cali, Colombia, all the way to Jackson Heights in New York City, where she met friends of family and started a home. And I do have her permission in telling this story. I know I want to make sure that I'm speaking from my perspective, but since that's my mother's story, I wanted to make sure that you all know that I had that permission. But I just wanted to tell that story because we often talk about resilience and grit with our students, when right now that buzzword puts the onus on the student to make sure that they're getting through and being successful. It puts the onus on them, and really the strength of these women, yes, it's because they're resilient and they have grit, but also it's because the communities and the families that they are in are resilient communities and families. If it was not without the aid of other people in the community and other family members, their stories could be very different. But it was through the persistence of community that I was able to have the luck and privilege of being born in the United States. And I recognize that is a privilege. and that even though I don't share the same understanding of what it means to be an immigrant to this country, oftentimes some of those assumptions are put on me simply because of the way I look. And I just wanted to bring that into this space today. So my story begins in New York City, a kid born in Queens, grew up in Jersey, and because of separation and meeting a new boyfriend who eventually becomes her husband, we end up in North Carolina, right? At the crucial age of, what are we in 6th grade? 10, 11, around there, right? So I'm 10, 11 in North Carolina, and where I've predominantly lived in multicultural, really diverse neighborhoods, I'm now in rural North Carolina, southern Alamance County, where I am in predominantly white middle school and a predominantly white high school. And I quickly learned that in order for me to survive, that I have to then now assimilate to whiteness. And that's where, when TRILCE talked about the story of her name before, so much of that resonates with me because I went through the same thing. You heard me pronounce my name as Dyson Pasión, right? I didn't reclaim that until very recently. Most people who knew me or who know me probably know me as Dason, right? Because when you look at my name, when it's anglicized, that's how you think it should be pronounced. And I didn't fight that in school. When teachers corrected me on my own pronunciation of my name, I was like, well, you're the teacher, I gotta respect you. So, okay, my name is Dason now. Okay. And I mean, even this morning, I got a call on how to pronounce my name, and this is from a person who knew me in high school, and they just they needed to know how to pronounce my name phonetically for another reason, but they have a son in high school, or a son who he and I went to the same high school, and when he asked his son, we just knew him as Dason Payson, right? So like that still follows me to this day, and it's an adjustment for me as well. And I catch myself mispronouncing my name when I'm introducing myself to new people. But as I've moved into a space of reclaiming my name and reclaiming the proper pronunciation, I'm now in that space of where TRILCE was talking about, of what it means to pronounce, to correct people on the pronunciation of your name, especially with people who have known you and for a while. And that whiteness, that the environment of that whiteness followed me, just not in school, but in my personal life as well. So as I mentioned, my mom remarried. So Rosario Maricel Rosales became Maricel Murray after they got married, to my dad, Greg Murray. You see an image of myself with my wife, who is white. In the bottom, you see a image of my immediate family that includes members of family members from my mother's side and from my dad's side. And in the bottom right image, it's an image of the immediate family of my wife. So you can see that in most of the spaces where I live and exist, even to this day, it is mostly a white space where I'm not fully able to be comfortable in my identity because I'm always surrounded by whiteness and I'm not in a space that either recognizes, right? Recognizes that I'm Latinx or celebrates the fact that I'm Latinx. And I want to pose this question to you all. When do you, or where does whiteness show up for you? And are you able to find space that affirms your identity? And as you process and reflect through that, please share in the chat. And I already see that everywhere, right? Everywhere. So for me as a student, I couldn't escape whiteness because it was in the classroom, it was in the school building, and it was back in my home. And it was, yep, it's our default and it's tiring. So I just want to thank you all for allowing us to share our story. I think I'm gonna turn it back over to TRILCE.
Thank you, Dyson. I think, you know, this idea of how tiring it can be is really important, because it was so tiring to correct people to say my name correctly. Like I didn't want to continue that process. And so when I think about our Latinx students, if we don't make space, we don't intentionally make space for them that celebrates and recognizes their Latinx identities, it becomes tiring to have to remind people to do that, right? And it can feel really defeating. And so I can imagine times in which students just give up, you know, they stop pushing because they're exhausted from constantly having to do that work. So Dyson, thank you for sharing that. I want to shift us a little bit into talking more about being a Latinx educator. So for me, this journey started, that picture there on the left, that is me on my very, very first day of being a teacher. That picture was taken at around 5 a.m. because my roommate and I would leave our apartment at around 5:30. We would jog to the subway station. I was teaching in New York. We jogged to the subway station and then ride about an hour to get to our school. And on the first day, of course, you wanted to be early, right? Everything about it felt nervous. But at that time, I didn't have a Latinx educator identity, right? I was still sort of in the process of being surrounded by whiteness, like Dyson had said, and had not thought about my identity as Latinx, and certainly hadn't thought about the ways in which I assimilated to whiteness. And as we know, about 80% of teachers nationally are white women. So as an educator, I was just emulating what was around me, which was white women. And particularly around me were white women who were ignoring the identities of the Black and brown students who they were teaching. I taught at predominantly Black and brown schools, and I never thought about the ways in which my identity or my students' identities were impacting the space that we were creating. I just didn't, right? And that's sort of what whiteness is the ability to push aside someone's identity and continue on. Then I really started to think about my own identity when my students really pushed me to do so. I'm forever thankful for being around kids. It is my favorite thing to do, to be in a space full of children. And that process sort of began as they began to share their own identities, their own values, and I wanted to help them fight for their identities. I wanted to help them fight for what they believed in and who they were. I wanted my students in front of me to feel whole. But that's a really hard thing to do when you don't know who you are, right? So as I was sort of beginning this process with them, as I was realizing that they were bringing to me parts of their identity that I needed to acknowledge, that I needed to respect, that I needed to celebrate, I began to ask myself those very same questions, right? Like, who am I? What do I value? What is my history? You know? And so we learned together, we learned in community. And I just can't be more thankful for, you know, the honesty and the ability of 8-year-olds to push me to understand who I was, because they needed me to understand who they were.
So I have a similar experience as well, where really my students drove me to really reflect and be critical of my identity as a Latinx educator. So when I was in the classroom, I worked at a middle school that was the majority of the students identify as Latino or Hispanic. Um, and in that environment, I was forced to see every day sort of and reflect back at my experience, because I worked in the same district that I grew up in. So I had to recognize and look at these students who were having the same experience that I was having all these years later, right? And we haven't really changed what we're providing for our students. So being able to really reflect on that and being forced to recognize that these students are looking up to me as someone that they identify with when I have no idea who I am. So that was a process, and I'm still in process of reversing that assimilation that happens, right, at so young of an age, and looking at how I've been colonized and continue to be colonized, and how I'm complicit and perpetuate some of that colonization myself, and look at how I can then sort of flip that on its head and be able to then put into practice some of these things, so future generations don't, so that experience may be different for future generations. So my journey as a Latinx educator was really rooted in that space, that community that you build with your students. And for me personally, that also meant that there's some like work to be done with colleagues, right? Because the people can see that I'm brown, but that never comes up in conversation, right? Unless it's brought to the forefront. So when I wanted to speak about these issues, I really couldn't do that until I had some credentials, right? Or some clout so people could hear me. So looking to find ways, and knowing that, okay, I have to know my stuff about my content. I have to be on point about pedagogy, right? I have to be up to date and know what I'm talking about so people take me seriously. So then now I can talk about sort of the struggles and some of the issues that we see in the Latinx community, especially in education here in North Carolina. And knowing that, you know, being a Latinx educator is also a political identity. And, even the term Latinx itself, right, is political. There's been so much you know what I'm trying to say. There's been so much geared towards how do we identify, right? Are we Hispanic, right? Are we Latino, Latina? Are we Latinx? Are we Latine, right? Are we Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx? And how does that, how the language that we use to identify, right? Even the Latinx itself is still colonized. It still centers the language family that colonized, you know, much of the Americas where Latina community come from. So being a Latinx educator, I'm basically saying, this is my political identity, right? And I have these images just to sort of just juxtapose some things that come to mind, right? So that image on the top, you can probably identify as from one of the May 16 rallies, right? Where thousands of teachers came out and thousands of public education supporters came out to really rally to provide and to support public education. And again, thousands of people all in downtown Raleigh out for that demonstration. But for a day without immigrants, which the second picture is captured from, there was maybe 100 people, if even, out there rallying and fighting and voicing support for our Latino community. And sort of the juxtaposition, if we can have thousands of people out there to support public education, but we can't also have thousands of people out there rallying for Latinx students, what are we doing, right? What message are we sending? And basically that just all boils down to identity, right? One rally is general for public education. The other rally is more specific to Latino community. So what's going on? So we're gonna switch it up a little bit. We've been able to talk about ourselves a bit, but we also wanted to talk about how, you know, we can celebrate Latinx identities in our classroom.
Thank you. I just wanted to take a second to acknowledge that I think there's like a really rich discussion happening in the chat and a lot of comments, particularly about intersectionality for a lot of our Latinx, maybe Afro-Caribbean or Afro-Latinx students, and sort of how to identify in that space or what happens to identities, as well as sort of the thinking around acknowledging first our own biases and how to move from that, or how to move forward from that, as well as sort of like resources, how to be involved. And I think all of these are really important and really great conversations to start and to think about. And I just wanted to acknowledge the chat on the side to tell you that we're hearing you, and hopefully maybe we can talk a little bit more during the Q&A if we have some time. But so we want to talk a little bit more now, centering it in our classrooms and in our schools. What are the ways that we can celebrate Latinx identities in our classrooms? One of the ways that we've found is that first you have to be really intentional about honoring and celebrating different identities in your classrooms and schools. This is not just like a thing that happens, right? You have to plan for these things. So one of the tools that we've found that has been really helpful in doing that work is called the Equitable Classroom Practices Checklist. It's adapted from a resource for equitable classroom practices from the 2010 Louisiana State Personnel Development Grant. And we have used this as a really great sort of self-reflection tools, right? What are the ways that our teaching practices are recognizing the power that is inherent in students, and what are the places that we need to grow in order to create space that is affirming, that is celebratory of the different identities that are in our classrooms. And I think Dyson is going to drop that in the chat as well, so that you can have it and take it with you. Although I think if you Google 27 equitable classroom practices, it tends to pop right up too. So the tool has three sort of like large buckets that it's divided into, and it's divided into the environment practices, engagement practices, and feedback practices. I sort of think about them like this. The learning environment practices usually tend to speak to sort of the physical space in your classroom practices. Now, I've been thinking a lot about this because for a lot of us, that physical space might not be where we're at in August or September, right? But I think it's really important now to think about, well, what does this mean when we switch it to a virtual space? It doesn't mean that we ignore the physical practices, right, or the physical environment practices. We have to think about how do we adapt them to the space maybe behind us, right, or around us. The second bucket, the engagement practices, speak to the ways that we build relationships with students to make sure that they can access the content and our lessons in a safe and comfortable learning environment. And then the last one is called the feedback practices. And those are the ways in which we sort of think about giving information to students about how they're meeting those sort of, I'm going to put them in quotes because that's a whole other conversation, but criteria for success or standards. And the ways, I think this to me tends to be the more important part, but the ways that we get feedback from students around our instruction, right? So it has those three, and it has practices for each one. And we're gonna go through just a few of those practices so that you can get a sense of what they say.
So I just dropped the link in the chat. There's also on the document, there is also a link to the original resource that has a good information on it as well. This is a document that we've adopted for the use of our office. But really, it is a self-reflective tool on how you are creating equitable spaces in your classroom. So looking specifically at two practices right now that really deal with the environment of your classroom or learning space. One, right, making sure that the displays and the materials, the curriculum used, right, the text selected, really represent the population in your classroom and in your school, right? And being diverse. So we're seeing all of these different perspectives, we're hearing these different voices, so that our Latino students really start to see themselves not only on the walls, right, but really see themselves in the curriculum, really see themselves in the text that they're reading, in the resources that they're using, so that they can start to really identify with their learning. Also, the power of language, right? We know words are powerful, right? And when TRILCE spoke before about the feeling she gets when she hears her name being pronounced correctly, and how we can recreate that for students when we acknowledge and value their heritage languages, right? Also, knowing that students may not feel comfortable in their heritage language, right? A lot of some of our students may not feel comfortable speaking in their heritage language, but there's still a feeling of I'm having trouble talking today. There's still this feeling of home, right? Of welcoming when they hear their heritage language, when they hear the language being spoken at home, and not just speaking it, but when they see it present, it could be up on walls, it could be included in texts, right? but even creating an environment where students know that their language is welcome really sets your environment in your classroom as a welcoming space for our Latino community. Just some examples to the contrary. I've been in classrooms where I've heard teachers say, as a student and as an educator, where I've heard teachers say, you can't speak Spanish in here. You have to speak English. Yeah, I was told as an adult by an administrator not to speak Spanish with a colleague, right? And this is before like, this was in a school where there was very few of us to begin with, right? And then that's something that we connected on was our language. And then when we're speaking in the hallway and an administrator comes down the hallway and asks us to stop because they believe that we're talking about them, right? That sends the wrong message. That does not make the environment welcoming or inclusive.
Before I talk about these last few practices, I want to just quickly say one more thing. One of the things that I found really empowering is being able to learn about my identity and decide who and how I want to be identified, right? And when I talk with kids a lot, I say, you know, no one gets to identify you for you. You get to identify yourself, and you can let other people know how you want them to identify you. But that's it, right? Don't let someone take that power away from you. Now, even Dyson and I have had conversations a while ago. You know, we were talking about Latinx versus Latine, right, with the E at the end. To think about sort of the colonization of coming from the Spanish language and the X versus the E. And I had to sort of think through that, you know, and I had to decide, what did I want? You know, I have personally moved away from Hispanic, and I decided that I at some point wanted to be Latina. And after a while, I chose Latinx, right? And now I'm sort of thinking about Latine or something else, right? Like my identity or the way that I choose to identify myself, that label can be shifting, right? As I learn, as I think, and as I talk with others. But one thing that I want to make clear is nobody gets to tell me whether or not I'm Latinx, right? That's for me. And in conversation with people that I trust, like Dyson, right? I get to explore meaning behind that identity. And I get to explore the meaning behind changing that label and changing that identity. So when you're thinking about how you identify, right? That's an important sort of like place to like grapple with and think about the differences between the words that you choose, because words do matter. But when you're talking with students or when you're talking with colleagues or others, I would ask. And until you have built relationship with people, I think that it's important to really think about whether or not you can tell them how they're about your perspective on how they identify, right? Dyson and I have a relationship, so we get to talk about that together. If somebody else is talking to me about that I didn't feel comfortable with or trust, that would feel like a harmful interaction for me. So I think I just want to put that into that space as we think about our students and as we think about our colleagues or, you know, other people. Okay, and I know we're like real running out of time, so I'm going to quickly go through some of these last practices. Thinking about how we co-construct experiences with students, seeking multiple perspectives. I often think about that as checking our bias when we think there is one way to get to a right answer, or we think there is a right answer, right? And allowing students to sort of like give knowledge into the space that we may not have, right? And so asking things like, that's one idea, do you have another one? That's one way to solve a problem. Who has an alternative way to do it? Or how else did somebody do it? Consistently, so it doesn't feel like, you know, I used to do that when my students would get the wrong answer. And that was my way of letting everyone know that that wasn't the way that I had done it, right? But consistently doing that to create space that says that I'm not the only person with the answers here. All of you have answers too, or different ways of doing it, and how do we constantly ask that? Valuing real life experiences for your students. You have to know your students first, right? And you have to be aware of the experiences that they have and make sure that those experiences aren't erased. And then one of my favorite ones, asking students for feedback on your instruction. I just want you to take a moment and think about, when was the last time that you honestly got feedback from your students about how your instruction was going with them, right? What was working and what wasn't working? How did the space that you had created together feel for them, right? And if it has been a while since students felt either comfortable enough to tell you or since you asked outright, I think that's something that we need to investigate as educators.
So we did not do very well on managing our time for Q&A, and we're coming up on 3 o'clock. We sincerely apologize. I know that there were a lot of questions in the chat. Please reach out to us. You can find us on Twitter. I'll drop my handle in the chat. And TRILCE, if you want to drop yours, and then please reach out if you have any questions. We really want to connect with you all. There is a feedback form and yes, thank you, Brittany. Thank you for dropping it in the chat. Brittany just dropped it in the chat, the survey and the CEU request. So if you can fill that out, that will be extremely helpful. But we just want to thank you all so much for joining us today and allowing us to share our perspectives with you all.
Thank you, everyone. Please be in touch.
Thank you so much, TRILCE and Dyson. That was just I don't want to speak for everyone, but a very heartfelt and deep session. And we appreciate your vulnerability and sharing with everyone so that we can all learn. I'm dropping in the CEU request. I'll be staying for a little bit longer to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to get that. You can drop in your handles again if you want as well. So I'm sure people will love to continue to connect with you. Yes, thank you. Cheryl, so unfortunately Zoom updated where they don't let you make an active link anymore. It's to stop people from adding links that would be predatory. So please copy and paste the link. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna like go sit and process everything that was just shared. Yep. I'm continuing to post the link. Does everyone have access? Did everyone get everything? The CEU request. Please let me know if you have any trouble accessing that feedback form. Awesome. Good to know it's working, Susie. They will not be available to download, but we are recording the session. Speaking of, I'm going to stop the recording.